Have you ever looked at your life and realized that everything you thought you knew was a carefully constructed lie? David Matthews sat in his empty apartment on a cold February morning, staring at the eviction notice in his trembling hands. 3 months ago, he had been a successful businessman with a comfortable retirement fund and dreams of opening the restaurant he'd always wanted. Now, at 54 years old, he had nothing left except the bitter taste of betrayal and a story that would haunt him forever. This is the story of how one man's search for love and purpose after losing his wife became the perfect setup for the most devastating con of his life. But before we dive into this incredible story, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you're going to want to follow this channel for more shocking real-life stories that will make you question everything you think you know about trust and human nature. David had never been the type of man to take risks. For 28 years, he'd worked as an operations manager for a mid-sized logistics company in Denver, Colorado. He lived a predictable life with his wife Sarah, saving money, planning for retirement, and dreaming of someday opening a small restaurant. Sarah had always encouraged his culinary passion, often joking that his homemade pasta was better than anything they served in the fancy Italian places downtown. They had simple dreams, simple plans, and a simple love that had weathered nearly 3 decades together. But life has a way of destroying even the most carefully laid plans. When Sarah was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2021, their world collapsed overnight. David watched helplessly as the disease ravaged the woman he loved, draining their savings and leaving him emotionally shattered. She passed away on a rainy Thursday in September, and with her went everything David thought he understood about happiness and purpose. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of relatives and colleagues who offered their condolences before disappearing back into their own lives. David found himself alone in a house that felt too big, too quiet, and too full of memories. The months following Sarah's death blurred together in a haze of grief and isolation. David's friends tried to reach out, inviting him to dinners and social gatherings, but he couldn't bring himself to pretend that life was normal. Work became his only anchor to reality, but even that felt hollow and meaningless. He'd sit at his desk, processing shipping schedules and inventory reports, wondering what the point of any of it was. His colleagues whispered about him in the break room, noting how he'd lost weight and how his once sharp attention to detail was slipping. It was during this dark period that David made the decision that would change everything. He realized that he couldn't continue living in the shadow of his past, surrounded by reminders of what he'd lost. Sarah had always encouraged him to pursue his dream of opening a restaurant, and now, with the life insurance payout and their modest savings, he finally had the capital to make it happen. More importantly, he needed something to live for again, a purpose that would honor Sarah's memory while giving him a reason to get up each morning. David began researching restaurant opportunities with the methodical approach that had served him well in his career. He studied market trends, analyzed demographics, and visited dozens of potential locations. His dream was simple but specific: a cozy neighborhood restaurant serving comfort food with a focus on fresh, locally sourced ingredients. He envisioned warm lighting, rustic wooden tables, and the kind of atmosphere where families would come to celebrate special occasions and couples would share intimate dinners. It would be called Sarah's Kitchen, a tribute to his wife and the love that had sustained him for so many years. The research phase consumed David's evenings and weekends, giving him something to focus on beyond his grief. He attended restaurant industry seminars, networked with local suppliers, and even took a part-time cooking class at the community college. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something resembling hope. This restaurant would be more than just a business. It would be his redemption, his way of building something meaningful from the ashes of his old life. It was at one of those restaurant industry networking events in downtown Denver where David first met Mei Lin. The event was held at a trendy gastropub, filled with aspiring restaurateurs, suppliers, and industry veterans sharing war stories over craft cocktails. David felt out of place among the younger, more energetic crowd, nursing a beer in the corner while listening to presentations about social media marketing and food truck trends. He was considering leaving early when she approached him. Mei Lin was strikingly beautiful in an understated way, with long black hair pulled back in an elegant ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see right through him. She appeared to be in her late 30s, though David would later learn she was actually 42. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged in professional settings. When she introduced herself, her voice carried a slight accent that David couldn't immediately place, though he would later learn she was originally from Vietnam. "You look like someone who's thinking very seriously about this business," she said, gesturing toward the presentation stage where a celebrity chef was discussing the importance of Instagram-worthy plating. "I'm Mei Lin. I couldn't help but notice you taking notes while everyone else is just here for the free drinks." David was immediately struck by her directness and intelligence. Unlike the other attendees who seemed more interested in networking than actual business planning, Mei Lin asked thoughtful questions about his concept and shared insights that demonstrated genuine industry knowledge. She explained that she had managed several restaurants in California before moving to Colorado and was currently looking for the right opportunity to invest in or partner with someone who shared her vision for quality dining. As the evening progressed, David found himself opening up to Mei Lin in ways he hadn't with anyone since Sarah's death. She listened intently as he described his vision for Sarah's kitchen, nodding appreciatively at his emphasis on fresh ingredients and community atmosphere. More surprisingly, she seemed genuinely moved when he explained the personal meaning behind the restaurant's name and his desire to honor his late wife's memory through the business. "There's something beautiful about building something meaningful from loss," Mei Lin said softly, her eyes reflecting a sadness that David recognized from his own mirror. "I understand that motivation more than you might think. I lost someone very important to me a few years ago, and it changed everything about what I wanted to do with my life." Over the following weeks, David and Mei Lin began meeting regularly to discuss the restaurant project. She suggested coffee shops and quiet bistros where they could spread out business plans and financial projections, always insisting on paying for their drinks despite David's protests. Her knowledge of restaurant operations was impressive and comprehensive. She could discuss everything from food cost percentages to labor scheduling with the expertise of someone who had spent years in the industry. Mei Lin shared stories from her previous restaurant experience that both educated and entertained David. She described the challenges of managing temperamental chefs, the importance of building relationships with reliable suppliers, and the delicate balance required to create a dining atmosphere that felt both professional and welcoming. Her insights were practical and valuable, and David found himself taking extensive notes during their conversations. What impressed David most was Mei Lin's apparent financial acumen. She explained complex business structures and financing options with the fluency of someone with formal business training. When David mentioned his plans to use his life insurance money and savings as startup capital, Mei Lin gently suggested that he might want to explore additional financing options to preserve his personal funds as a safety net. She spoke knowledgeably about SBA loans, investor partnerships, and equipment leasing arrangements that could help maximize his capital efficiency. However, there were subtle inconsistencies in Mei Lin's stories that David's grief-clouded judgment failed to recognize as red flags. She mentioned having managed restaurants in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, but when David asked for specific names or references, she would deflect with vague explanations about confidentiality agreements or complicated business relationships. When pressed for details about her previous successes, she would shift the conversation back to David's project, praising his vision and encouraging him to move forward quickly before the perfect location was taken by competitors. Mei Lin also displayed an unusual urgency about certain aspects of the business planning process. She frequently emphasized the importance of moving quickly in the competitive Denver restaurant market, suggesting that David's methodical approach might cause him to miss out on prime opportunities. She introduced concepts like a market timing and first-mover advantage that made David feel like his careful planning was actually a liability rather than an asset. Most concerning, though David didn't recognize it at the time, was Mei Lin's subtle but persistent focus on the business's legal structure and ownership arrangements. She suggested that given her industry experience and his financial investment, they should consider forming a partnership that would allow her to handle the operational complexities while he focused on the creative and financial aspects of the business. As winter turned to spring, David's relationship with Mei Lin evolved beyond simple business planning into something deeper and more complex. She began calling him in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss restaurant details, but often drifting into more personal conversations about their hopes, fears, and shared experiences of loss. These calls became the highlight of David's day, filling the lonely hours that had previously been consumed by grief and regret. Mei Lin revealed more about her background during these intimate conversations, painting a picture of herself as someone who had overcome significant hardships to build a successful career in America. She described growing up in a small village outside Ho Chi Minh City, immigrating to the United States as a teenager with her family, and working multiple jobs while putting herself through business school. Her stories were compelling and emotionally resonant, creating a narrative of resilience and determination that David found both inspiring and attractive. The emotional connection between them deepened when Mei Lin shared the story of her previous relationship and loss. She explained that she had been engaged to a successful businessman in California who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving her emotionally devastated and financially vulnerable. The parallels to David's own experience with Sarah's death created an immediate and powerful bond between them. They understood each other's grief in ways that others couldn't, and this shared understanding became the foundation of their growing intimacy. David found himself increasingly dependent on Mei Lin's guidance and support, not just for business decisions, but for emotional stability. She had a way of making him feel capable and confident about the future when he had been struggling with doubt and depression for months. Her enthusiasm for the restaurant project rekindled his own passion for the venture, and her belief in his abilities made him feel like the successful businessman he had once been before grief had undermined his confidence. This emotional dependency was reinforced by Mei Lin's growing involvement in every aspect of the restaurant planning process. She accompanied David to meetings with potential landlords, suppliers, and contractors, often taking the lead in negotiations while positioning herself as his business partner and trusted advisor. Her presence in these meetings lent credibility to David's project and helped him secure better deals than he believed he could have achieved on his own. However, this increased involvement also meant that Mei Lin was gradually taking control of critical business decisions and relationships. She insisted on being the primary contact for landlords and suppliers, explaining that her industry connections and negotiation experience would benefit the project. She encouraged David to delegate the operational details to her while he focused on the big picture financial and creative aspects of the restaurant. The warning signs were becoming more obvious, but David's emotional investment in both the business and his relationship with Mei Lin made him resistant to acknowledging them. When friends or family members expressed concerns about moving too quickly or partnering with someone he had known for such a short time, David became defensive and isolated himself further from their advice. By late spring, David and Mei Lin had identified the perfect location for Sarah's Kitchen, a charming corner space in a trendy Denver neighborhood with high foot traffic and reasonable rent. The space had previously housed a failed coffee shop, which meant it already had basic kitchen infrastructure and dining room layout that could be adapted to their needs. David was excited about the opportunity, but the landlord required immediate action due to interest from other potential tenants. This is where Mei Lin's influence over David's decision-making became most apparent and most dangerous. She convinced him that the competitive rental market required them to move quickly and decisively, even if it meant making some compromises on the business structure they had originally discussed. The landlord preferred to deal with a single primary tenant rather than a partnership, and Mei Lin suggested that since she had more recent restaurant industry experience and better credit history, it would be strategic for the lease to be in her name initially. "We can always adjust the legal paperwork later," she assured David during a late-night phone call when he expressed hesitation about the arrangement. "Right now, we need to secure this space before someone else takes it. Once we're established and profitable, we can restructure everything exactly how you want it. But if we lose this location because we're worried about paperwork details, we might not find another opportunity this good for months." David's desperation to move forward with the project, combined with his growing emotional dependence on Mei Lin, overrode his natural caution about such arrangements. He agreed to let her sign the lease while he provided the security deposit and first month's rent from his personal funds. It felt like a practical compromise that would allow them to secure the space while working out the legal details later. The pattern continued with other critical business decisions over the following weeks. Equipment purchases, supplier agreements, and contractor relationships were all established in Mei Lin's name, with David providing the funding while trusting her to handle the operational complexities. Each decision was presented as a temporary expedient that would be corrected once the restaurant was established. But the cumulative effect was that David was providing all the capital while Mei Lin was accumulating all the legal control. The renovation process consumed the rest of David's available capital much faster than anticipated. What had originally been budgeted as a modest refresh of the existing space turned into a complete overhaul involving electrical work, plumbing upgrades, and expensive kitchen equipment that Mei Lin insisted was necessary for the restaurant's success. David watched his life insurance money and retirement savings disappear into contractor payments and equipment purchases, but Mei Lin's enthusiasm and expertise made each expense seem justified and necessary. "You have to spend money to make money in this business," she would tell him whenever he expressed concern about the mounting costs. "Cutting corners on equipment or atmosphere will hurt us in the long run. We're building something that will generate income for decades, so we need to invest properly from the beginning." The most significant warning sign came when David suggested involving a lawyer to formalize their partnership agreement and clarify ownership structures before the restaurant opened. Mei Lin reacted with unexpected emotion, expressing hurt that David would question their trust and partnership after everything they had built together. She suggested that bringing lawyers into their relationship would create unnecessary complications and expenses that could jeopardize the restaurant's opening timeline. "After everything we've shared and planned together, I thought you trusted me," she said, her voice breaking with apparent emotion. "If you want to involve lawyers and formal contracts, maybe I've misunderstood what kind of partnership this is supposed to be." The truth began to unravel on a humid Tuesday morning in early August, just 2 weeks before Sarah's Kitchen was scheduled to open. David arrived at the restaurant space early to check on the final preparations, excited to see the dining room with its new tables and chairs arranged for the first time. Instead, he found the space completely empty, stripped of everything from the expensive kitchen equipment to the custom-made wooden tables that had been his pride and joy. At first, David assumed there had been a break-in or some kind of mistake. He immediately called Mei Lin, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried calling the contractors and suppliers they had worked with over the past months, but most of their numbers were no longer in service. When he finally reached the equipment supplier, the representative explained that all the items had been legally repossessed due to non-payment on the leasing agreements that Mei Lin had signed. "Sir, according to our records, the account is severely delinquent," the supplier explained with professional detachment. "We sent multiple notices to the address on file but received no response. The equipment was removed yesterday as specified in the lease agreement." David drove to the apartment address that Mei Lin had given him, only to discover that the building manager had never heard of anyone by that name. The apartment she claimed to live in was occupied by a family who had been there for over 2 years. When David showed them Mei Lin's photo, they had no recognition of her at all. The horrifying scope of his situation became clear over the following days as David desperately tried to piece together what had happened. The restaurant lease was indeed in Mei Lin's name, and according to the landlord, she had officially terminated it the previous week, citing changed business circumstances. All the supplier relationships, contractor agreements, and business licenses were in her name, and she had apparently been systematically liquidating or canceling them while maintaining the pretense of moving forward with the restaurant opening. The financial damage was staggering and comprehensive. David had invested nearly $300,000 of his life insurance money and retirement savings into the restaurant project, and virtually all of it was gone. The equipment they had purchased was either repossessed due to non-payment or had been sold by Mei Lin to unknown buyers. The renovation work had been completed but was now worthless since they no longer had access to the space. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this. Have you or anyone you know ever experienced something similar? Maybe not on this scale, but Have you ever trusted someone completely only to discover they were manipulating you the entire time? Leave a comment below and share your experience because David's story shows us how these situations can happen to anyone, no matter how smart or successful they think they are. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more incredible real-life stories that will shock and amaze you. Most devastating of all was the realization that everything David thought he knew about Mei Lin had been a carefully constructed lie. There was no record of her having managed restaurants in California, no business degree, and apparently no previous experience in the industry beyond what she had researched online to make her stories convincing. Even her personal background appeared to be largely fabricated, designed to create emotional connection and trust with her target. David's attempts to track down Mei Lin and recover his money led him into a nightmare world of legal complications and psychological manipulation that he was completely unprepared to handle. When he finally managed to contact her through a different phone number he found in some old paperwork, her response was cold, calculated, and terrifying in its complete lack of empathy or remorse. "I'm sorry you feel like you've been misled," she said with chilling calmness when David confronted her about the missing money and equipment. "But everything we did was completely legal. You chose to give me money for business expenses, and I used that money exactly as we discussed. If you're unhappy with the business decisions I made, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't make them illegal." When David threatened to involve the police and lawyers, Mei Lin's response revealed the true calculating nature of her personality. She calmly explained that pursuing legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile since all the business agreements and financial transactions had been structured to protect her from criminal liability. More disturbing, she suggested that David's emotional state and recent grief made him an unreliable witness whose version of events would be difficult to prove in court. "You're a lonely, grieving widower who made poor business decisions while trying to deal with his wife's death," she said with brutal directness. "Who do you think a jury is going to believe? The successful businesswoman who tried to help a friend start a restaurant, or the emotionally unstable man who claims he was tricked into giving away his life savings?" The psychological pressure intensified when Mei Lin began subtly threatening David's reputation and professional standing. She had gathered extensive personal information about him during their months of intimate conversations, including details about his work history, family relationships, and financial situation. She suggested that if he continued to pursue legal action or tried to damage her reputation, she would be forced to share information about his emotional instability and poor judgment with his employer and professional contacts. David found himself trapped in a situation where pursuing justice would potentially destroy what remained of his life and career. The stress of the situation began affecting his work performance, causing him to make mistakes and miss deadlines that further undermined his professional confidence. His supervisor called him into meetings expressing concern about his recent performance and suggesting that he might benefit from counseling or time off to deal with his personal issues. The isolation became complete when David's attempts to seek support from friends and family backfired. His story sounded so incredible and his decision-making so obviously flawed that many people struggled to believe he could have been so thoroughly deceived. Some friends suggested that his grief had impaired his judgment, while others implied that he must have known something was wrong but chose to ignore the warning signs because of his emotional involvement with Mei Lin. "How could you give someone you barely knew access to all your money?" his brother asked during a particularly painful phone conversation. "I mean, I understand you were lonely and grieving, but $300,000? Didn't you think to check her background or involve a lawyer before making that kind of commitment?" The shame and embarrassment of admitting how completely he had been manipulated made David withdraw further from his support network precisely when he needed help the most. He stopped returning phone calls from concerned friends and avoided social situations where he might have to explain what had happened to his restaurant dreams and financial security. The turning point in David's story came not through legal victories or financial recovery, but through a gradual recognition that allowing Mei Lin's manipulation to destroy the rest of his life would be the ultimate victory for her calculated cruelty. The process began when David finally sought professional help from a therapist who specialized in financial fraud and manipulation victims. Dr. Sarah Chen, ironically sharing a name with David's late wife, helped him understand that what had happened to him was not a simple case of poor judgment, but a sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to exploit his grief and vulnerability. She explained how con artists like Mei Lin systematically identify and target people going through major life transitions using techniques that would fool even highly intelligent and successful individuals. What happened to you was not random bad luck, Dr. Chen explained during one of their early sessions. You were specifically targeted because of your circumstances, and every interaction was designed to build trust while isolating you from people who might have questioned what was happening. The fact that you were grieving and vulnerable doesn't make you stupid or weak. It makes you human. This professional validation gave David permission to stop blaming himself for the deception and start focusing on recovery and prevention. Dr. Chen helped him understand the psychological techniques Mei Lin had used, from love bombing and emotional mirroring to gradual boundary erosion and financial dependency. Understanding these tactics helped David realize that his experience was part of a pattern rather than a personal failing. The therapeutic process also helped David reconnect with his sense of self-worth and competence that had been systematically undermined by Mei Lin's manipulation. He began to remember his decades of successful professional performance, his loving marriage to Sarah, and his genuine skills and talents that existed independently of this devastating experience. The restaurant dream had been real and achievable. It had simply been hijacked by someone who recognized its value and his vulnerability. David began taking practical steps to rebuild his financial security and professional reputation. He consulted with a financial advisor who helped him assess his remaining assets and develop a recovery plan that would allow him to rebuild his retirement savings over time. While the financial damage was severe, it was not completely insurmountable for someone with his earning potential and work ethic. He also consulted with several attorneys who confirmed that Mei Lin had indeed structured their business relationship to minimize her legal liability while maximizing her access to his funds. While criminal prosecution would be difficult to pursue, there were potential civil remedies that might allow him to recover some of his losses, though the process would be expensive and time-consuming with uncertain outcomes. Most importantly, David began the process of rebuilding his social connections and support network that had been damaged by shame and isolation. He reached out to old friends and colleagues, sharing his story honestly while asking for their understanding and support. Many people responded with surprising compassion and even shared their own experiences with manipulation and financial fraud. The decision to fight back took on larger meaning when David learned that Mei Lin had apparently used similar tactics to defraud other vulnerable individuals. A private investigator he consulted found evidence suggesting that she had operated various business scams targeting recently divorced or widowed individuals with significant assets. David realized that pursuing legal action might not just be about his own recovery, but about preventing other people from experiencing similar devastation. David's recovery process ultimately took nearly 2 years of consistent therapy, financial planning, and gradual rebuilding of his personal and professional relationships. The journey was neither quick nor easy, but it led him to insights about resilience, trust, and human nature that he might never have achieved without experiencing such profound loss and betrayal. One of the most important realizations was that his love for Sarah and his dream of honoring her memory through a restaurant remained valid and meaningful, despite how they had been exploited by Mei Lin's manipulation. Dr. Chen helped him understand that reclaiming those dreams, even in modified form, was essential to his emotional recovery and long-term happiness. David eventually returned to his culinary interests, though in a much more modest and carefully planned way. He began volunteering at a local community center, teaching cooking classes for seniors and recent immigrants. The experience of sharing his genuine skills and passion for food with people who appreciated his knowledge helped rebuild his confidence and sense of purpose. The community center classes became so popular that David was eventually offered a part-time paid position coordinating their culinary programs. The financial recovery was slower but steady. David's company had been understanding about his personal crisis and performance issues, allowing him to take extended leave for therapy while maintaining his employment and benefits. He worked with a financial planner to maximize his remaining retirement contributions and develop a conservative investment strategy that would allow him to rebuild his savings over the final decade of his career. More surprisingly, David discovered that his experience with financial fraud had given him valuable insights that he could share with others in similar situations. He began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that provided support and resources to fraud victims, particularly targeting older adults who are often the most vulnerable to sophisticated scams. His ability to understand both the psychological and financial aspects of these crimes made him an effective advocate and counselor for other victims. The process of helping others also helped David process his own anger and shame about what had happened. He realized that the epidemic of financial fraud targeting vulnerable adults was a serious social problem that required community awareness and prevention efforts. His personal experience, while devastating, had given him knowledge and credibility that could help protect other people from similar exploitation. David's story also became part of his healing when he began sharing it publicly through victim advocacy organizations and community education programs. Speaking about his experience was initially terrifying and emotionally exhausting, but it proved to be powerfully therapeutic while serving an important public service function. His presentations helped other potential victims recognize warning signs and manipulation tactics while encouraging existing victims to seek help and support. The legal case against Mei Lin eventually resulted in a modest financial settlement that covered a fraction of David's losses but provided some symbolic vindication of his claims. More importantly, the investigation led to criminal charges against her for fraud schemes involving several other victims, potentially preventing future crimes and giving David a sense that justice had been served, even if not completely. 3 years after the restaurant debacle, David had rebuilt much of his financial security and all of his personal confidence. He maintained his volunteer work with fraud prevention organizations while planning a genuine retirement that would include traveling, cooking, and possibly writing about his experiences. The dream of opening a restaurant had evolved into a more sustainable passion for culinary education and community service. Most importantly, David had learned to trust again, though with greater wisdom and caution about protecting his emotional and financial boundaries. He developed a close friendship with Dr. Chen that eventually grew into a romantic relationship based on mutual respect, shared interests, and complete honesty about their respective past experiences with loss and recovery. The final lesson of David's story is that even the most devastating betrayal and loss can become the foundation for greater wisdom, deeper compassion, and more meaningful connection with others. His experience taught him that trust is essential to human happiness but must be earned gradually and protected carefully. The difference between healthy vulnerability and dangerous naivety often lies in taking time to verify claims, maintaining independent judgment, and never risking more than you can afford to lose, whether financially or emotionally. David's message to others who might find themselves in similar situations is simple but profound. The shame belongs to the person who chooses to exploit vulnerability, not to the person who chooses to trust and hope. Recovery is possible, justice can be achieved even if not perfectly, and the capacity for love and trust can be rebuilt stronger than before when it's based on wisdom rather than desperation. If David's story has resonated with you, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel for more incredible real-life stories that explore the complexities of human nature and the power of resilience. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on trust, recovery, or any similar experiences you or people you know might have faced. And please share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding how sophisticated these manipulation schemes can be, because awareness and education are our best defenses against those who would exploit our hopes and vulnerabilities. Remember, every story of survival and recovery gives hope to someone else who is struggling with their own challenges, and your engagement helps us continue sharing these important messages with people who need to hear them.